Hey everyone, you ready to dig into some really fascinating new parenting research?
I'm ready.
We're really unpacking a study here that completely changed the way you think about raising happy, well-adjusted kids.
I think a lot of parents are really going to appreciate this one.
Yeah.
It's called Revolutionizing Parenting. And what's so cool about it is that it kind of moves past those simplistic labels like authoritarian versus permissive.
Right.
And we're really talking about a much more, I guess you could say, nuanced view of family dynamics. Like what's really going on in these families.
Okay, so how did they do that? Because we've heard authoritarian, we've heard permissive, like,
Right.
how's this different?
So they followed over 600 families,
Okay.
which is a lot of data.
Yeah.
But instead of just asking the parents, to label their own style, they actually observed a lot of these interactions.
Oh, interesting.
And they were measuring things like warmth, discipline, and even those subtle psychological control tactics that, sometimes we don't even realize we're using as parents.
Okay, so this wasn't just like fill out this questionnaire. They had to like
Right. It was much more in depth.
be observed.
And because of that, it really acts like a mirror, I think, for parents
Hmm.
to see maybe some of those blind spots in our own parenting.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so they identified 4 distinct parenting styles,
Yes.
and they used something called cluster analysis. Now, I don't have a PhD. What is that?
So imagine like you're looking at a forest, right? And instead of just focusing on like each individual tree, cluster analysis, it's kind of like taking a step back
Okay.
and seeing the overall patterns,
Interesting.
the way things naturally group together.
Uh-huh.
And this gives us a much more realistic picture, I think, of what's going on in families, more so than just saying, okay, you're this type of parent or you're that type of parent.
So instead of authoritarian or permissive,
Yeah.
we have these 4 distinct parenting styles. Okay, I'm ready. Hit me.
All right. So first up is what they call congruent authoritative.
Congruent authoritative.
And these parents, they're all about setting clear boundaries for their kids.
Okay,
But they do it with a lot of love and understanding.
Well,
So you
no.
can think of it as firm but fair.
got it.
Right. They're not afraid to say no. But they're also, they're very loving and supportive. And not surprisingly, this study found that this style is linked to like the best outcomes for kids.
Really?
Yeah, so these kids, they tend to be very well adjusted, they do better in school, and they have stronger social skills. And I think it really highlights that importance of balance.
Yeah.
You need structure
Structure and warmth.
and you need warmth.
Okay, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
What about positive authoritative?
Positive authoritative. So they're similar to the congruent authoritative parents in that they really value warmth and structure, but they might not be as consistent.
Okay.
So maybe sometimes they're a little bit more lenient with the rules.
So it's like authoritatively.
Authoritative late. Exactly. And their kids, they still do well, don't get me wrong, but the positive effects that we see with the congruent authoritative style, they're just not quite as strong.
Interesting. So consistency is key here.
Consistency is key.
All right. Let's go to maybe the less sunny side of the spectrum. Congruent authoritarian. So these are the parents that are all about rules, discipline, obedience,
Right.
structure.
Not a lot of laughs. Not a whole lot of laughs. And unfortunately, this style was linked to some of the least favorable outcomes for kids.
Really?
Yeah. And we're talking increased risk of behavioral issues, anxiety, even lower academic achievement. So it can really backfire.
Yeah, I could see how that kind of environment, not a lot of room to make mistakes.
Right.
Just kind of always worried about, toeing the line.
Yeah, it can definitely create a lot of pressure.
Yeah. So warmth, understanding, just as important as setting those boundaries.
Absolutely.
Okay. This last one, though, congruent intrusive. So these are the parents that maybe on the surface seem affectionate,
Right.
but they rule with guilt trips and manipulation.
Yeah.
What is that about?
This is a fascinating one because I think on the surface it might seem like a more hands-off approach, right? Like, oh, they're not, as strict. They're
No.
not, yelling all the time. But when you factor in that psychological control, then it becomes clear that it's anything but hands-off.
So before we go any further, we have to talk about this whole psychological control thing because
Yeah.
this study makes it very clear. This is a big deal.
Huge.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting about this, right? Because I think, we always think of like, kind of harsh punishment when we think about damaging, parenting tactics. But this is really saying that even if you're showering your kid with love if you're using those manipulative tactics, it can really do some damage.
It's true, and it just kind of highlights how complex parenting can be. It's
Yeah.
not enough to just have, like, good intentions, right?
Right.
We have to be really mindful of the subtle ways that, we might be impacting our children's emotional development.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've got these 4 parenting styles, and we've established that psychological control is a big no-no. But what about those situations where mom and dad don't exactly see eye to eye on the adult approach? Does that make a difference?
It does, and that's where I think things get even more interesting, because the study found that when parents present kind of a united front, meaning they have a similar parenting style, it makes a huge difference for the child.
So even if both parents are, say, a bit too authoritarian, that consistency is still better than having one parent who's super strict and one who's really lenient.
It's exactly that. Think of it this way. When kids are getting these mixed messages all the time,
Right.
it's confusing,
Yeah.
creates anxiety. But when they kind of know what to expect, even if those expectations, aren't ideal, it creates a sense of stability, which
Right.
is so important for kids. And plus, let's be honest, it's probably a lot less stressful for the parents, too.
Oh, less arguing.
Right. Less like second guessing each other. Yeah, I can see the appeal there. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, but let's bring it back to those kids for a second. How do these different parenting styles actually play out in a child's life? What does it look like?
Well, the study found some pretty clear links between parenting style and specific outcomes in children.
Like what? Give me the details.
Okay, so as we mentioned, congruent authoritative parenting, that was like the clear winner, right?
Yeah.
So their kids tended to be more pro-social, meaning they were more likely to help others, show empathy. They also had higher levels of self-control, and they performed better academically.
It's like the recipe for success.
Right.
So what about those kids that were raised with the other style? So like what about those positive authoritative parents? So with the positive authoritative, remember, they're similar to the congruent authoritative, but maybe a little less consistent. Their kids still generally did well.
Okay.
But we saw a slight dip in some of those positive outcomes. For example, their academic performance was good, but not quite as high.
So maybe not valedictorian, but
Yeah.
still, on a roll.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about then, like those kids who are raised with more of those controlling parents?
So that's where we start to see some bigger differences. Children of congruent authoritarian parents, remember, those are the ones with the strict rules, not a lot of warmth, they tended to struggle.
In what ways?
So they were more likely to display what we call externalizing behaviors, things like aggression, defiance, basically acting out.
Oh, so that's really interesting because it's that kind of behavior that can make it tough to, focus in school, make friends.
Exactly. But we also saw an increase in what we call internalizing behaviors. So things like anxiety, withdrawal, even depression.
Mhm.
And it's almost like they're bottling up all of these emotions.
That's heartbreaking and probably leads to, a whole other set of challenges in itself.
Absolutely. And academically, they tended to lag behind their peers a little bit. And it's not that these kids aren't intelligent, right?
Yeah.
But when you're constantly worried about, pleasing your parents or afraid to make a mistake, it's really hard to thrive.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. You're walking on eggshells.
Exactly.
So it's a stark contrast.
It is.
The warmth, the structure versus that kind of control and fear. So what about that last group, the congruent, intrusive parents? How did their kids fare?
So this is really where I think that psychological control factor comes into play, because while these kids didn't necessarily have more behavioral problems than, say, those with congruent authoritarian parents,
Interesting.
they still weren't doing as well as those kids that were raised with that authoritative parenting.
So even though they were getting that affection, those manipulation tactics still took a toll.
Unfortunately, yes. So we saw higher levels of anxiety and depression in these kids, and it just really highlights, again, I think, how insidious that psychological control can be. It eats away at a child's sense of self-worth, their security, even if it's not as overt as, harsh discipline.
That is so important, I think, for parents to understand. There's such a big difference between, really trying to control your child's behavior versus really supporting their emotional development.
100%. And that's really the heart of this study, right?
Yeah.
It's not about labeling parents as good or bad. It's about really understanding the impact of our choices and striving to create a home environment that truly supports our children's well-being.
In all aspects.
In all aspects of their lives.
It's not about, like, being perfect parents. It's about being mindful
Right.
and creating that supportive environment no matter what. So how do we do that? How can we actually use this information to become better parents?
It really starts with you. Like, take an honest look at your own parenting style. Which of these four styles do you see yourself in? And don't just think about, like, the big picture. Really reflect on your everyday interactions with your kids.
So like those everyday moments, those little reactions that might, reveal a pattern.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly that. How do you respond when your child is struggling with something? How do you set limits? Are you quick to, maybe resort to those guilt trips or threats? That honest self-reflection is so important.
It's like that saying, awareness is the first step.
Right.
But it's the first step to becoming, a more mindful parent. Okay, so we're aware of our tendencies. Now what?
Now it's time for, like, the parenting huddle.
Okay, I like it.
Right. You got to have that open and honest conversation with your partner. Talk about the styles that resonate with each of you and why. And just remember, you're on the same team.
Right.
This isn't about, like, winning an argument.
Right.
It's about finding that common ground so you can best support your kids.
Yeah, because even if you realize, wow, we have very different parenting styles, approaching it as a problem to solve together.
Absolutely.
And hopefully you discover that, you have more in common than you thought.
Exactly. And I think even if you don't perfectly align on every single thing, just aiming for that consistency is huge. Kids thrive on predictability, knowing what to expect.
Totally. Okay, so we're self-aware, we're communicating with our partners, we're striving for consistency. How do we actually put this congruent, authoritative style into action? What does that look like day to day?
So it's about finding that sweet spot, I think, between warmth and structure, setting those clear boundaries, fostering their emotional intelligence. It's not about being, permissive, and it's definitely not about resorting to those, guilt trips or manipulation.
So ditch the because I said so
Exactly.
and actually explain the reasoning behind the rules.
I think that's so important because think about it, even as adults, like, we appreciate understanding the why behind things.
Yeah.
Right.
1000%.
Kids are no different. And when we explain our reasoning, it not only encourages their cooperation, but it helps them develop that internal compass, to guide them.
So you're really helping them become independent thinkers,
Exactly.
not just rule followers.
Right. Exactly. And that's a key part, I think, of fostering that emotional intelligence, which is another cornerstone of that congruent authoritative parenting. It's about creating that space where kids feel safe expressing their emotions.
Even the negative ones.
Even the negative ones.
Yeah.
Validating their feelings without, necessarily giving in to their every demand.
So when that tantrum erupts over, not getting the right toy, it's not the end of the world. It's an opportunity to, really teach them how to cope.
Exactly. All feelings are valid, but not all behaviors are acceptable.
I like that. Okay, this has been so insightful. This research, though, it focused on a very specific group of families, right? Mainly middle class and Caucasian. How might these parenting styles play out in different cultures, different socioeconomic backgrounds?
That's such an important point to bring up because what's considered, authoritative in one culture might be perceived very differently in another.
Right.
Right. And so I think we have to consider, cultural norms, socioeconomic factors, even neighborhood environments, because those can all influence family dynamics.
So there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach.
No, definitely not. But I think it's about understanding the underlying principles of these styles and then adapting them to your own family's values and circumstances.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about. We've explored some really fascinating research, challenged, some conventional wisdom, and hopefully we've given you some tools to enhance your own parenting journey. Any final thoughts before we sign off?
Parenting is a marathon, not a sprint. So be kind to yourself, stay connected with your kids, and never, ever underestimate the power of a supportive, loving environment.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And we'll leave you to continue the conversation with your family. Until next time, happy parenting.